The man at my door said my son had put up my house for a $740,000 business loan. He had the paperwork. He said I was the collateral. I am a retired attorney. I had 10 seconds to decide how to play it. My son, Michael, was a 32-year-old restaurant owner. I knew he was struggling, but I never imagined this. The documents in the stranger's hand forced a terrible choice: use the law to protect everything I'd built, or find a way to protect my son. This is the story of a loan that never should have been made, a signature that was never given, and the night I discovered my own child might have committed a felony. I bought this house in 1979. The deed has been in my name and only my name for 45 years. My wife Alina and I raised Michael here. We paid off the mortgage the year he graduated high school. When Alina passed, the house became my anchor, a fixed point. I practiced law for 38 years, mostly estate planning and property law. I retired at 68. My life was quiet, predictable. Breakfast at 7, the newspaper, a walk. Michael's restaurant, the Oak Room, was his dream. He opened it 5 years ago. I was proud, but I'm also a realist. The restaurant business is a brutal machine. I'd seen the statistics. 60% fail within the first year, 80% within 5. I told him to start small. He wanted a flagship. He leased a 2-story building in a trendy neighborhood, took out a standard business loan for $200,000. I cosigned. It was a calculated risk. He was my son. He worked 7 days a week. For the first 2 years, he broke even. Then, the third year, he started talking about expansion, a second location. I advised against it. The economy was turning. He didn't listen. He found a space across town. He needed capital. He came to me on a Tuesday evening. He asked if I would take a second mortgage on this house. I said no. Not because I didn't believe in him, but because mixing family assets with business volatility is how you lose everything. We argued. He said I was being overly cautious, that I didn't understand modern entrepreneurship. I told him I understood risk better than he ever would. He left angry. That was 18 months ago. We spoke less after that. He was busy, I told myself. But the truth was, a wall had gone up. I'd see him at Sunday dinners, but he was distracted. His phone was always buzzing. He lost weight. The light in his eyes, the one he had when he first opened the doors, was gone. I offered to help review his books, just to look. He refused. He said he had it under control. Then 6 months ago, the calls started, not from Michael, from numbers I didn't recognize. When I'd answer, there'd be a pause, then a click. I'd call Michael. He'd say it was probably telemarketers, but I'd been a lawyer too long. That silence on the line wasn't a telemarketer. It was someone checking to see if I was home. Then 3 months ago, a letter arrived from a commercial lending firm called Meridian Capital Partners. It was addressed to me, but it was about a business loan for the Oak Room LLC. It listed this house as a pledged asset. I assumed it was a mistake, a marketing ploy. I called Michael. He sounded exhausted. He said, "Dad, it's nothing. They send those to every property owner in the county. It's a scam, throw it away." I wanted to believe him, so I threw it away, but I kept a copy. I put it in the filing cabinet in my study, next to my old case files. A week later, a man in a suit came to the door during the day. I was in the garden. He said he was from the county assessor's office, needed to verify some details about the property for a tax filing. He asked if I owned the home outright. I said yes. Asked if there were any liens against the property I was aware of. I said no. He thanked me and left. It felt off. County assessors don't make house calls, not anymore. I drove to the county recorder's office the next day. I pulled the property records for my address. There it was, filed 8 weeks prior. A UCC-1 financing statement, a legal form that puts a lien on personal property for a loan. But this wasn't against personal property. It was against my real property. My house, it listed Meridian Capital Partners as the secured party. The debtor was listed as the Oak Room LLC, but the collateral description was my home's legal address and parcel number. My hands went cold right there at the public terminal. This wasn't a mistake. This was a filing, a lien. I went straight to Michael's restaurant. It was 2 in the afternoon. The place was empty. He was at the bar, staring at a spreadsheet on a laptop. I didn't say hello. I put a copy of the filing on the bar. I said, "Explain this." He looked at it and his face went pale. He said, "Dad, I can explain." He said his expansion loan had fallen through. His primary lender had pulled out. He was facing closure. He met a broker who said he could secure a loan quickly based on assets. Michael told him he didn't have any. The broker asked about family. Michael mentioned me. The broker said if Michael could show a vested interest in a high-value asset, like his father's house, they could structure a loan. Michael told him he was on the deed. He lied. He forged a quitclaim deed adding his name to my title. He used that forged deed as collateral to secure a $740,000 loan from Meridian Capital. The money was gone. 6 months of payroll, supplier debts, lease payments. The restaurant was still sinking. And now Meridian had a lien on my home. If Michael defaulted, they could foreclose on my house. I stood there listening to my son confess to felony fraud, forgery, theft by deception. I asked him one question. Did you sign my name? He couldn't look at me. He nodded. The stranger at my door a week later wasn't from the county. He was from Meridian Capital, a portfolio manager. He said they were conducting a routine collateral verification. He had the original loan file. He needed me to confirm a few details. He was polite, professional, and he had the forged deed in his hand with my forged signature. I had 10 seconds to decide. Admit I knew it was a fraud which would trigger a criminal investigation into my son, or play along, confirm the details and buy time. I played along. I confirmed the details. I even pointed to the notary stamp and said, "Yes, that looks like my signature." I sold my integrity in that moment. To save my son from prison, the man left satisfied. I closed the door and leaned against it. The silence in my house was absolute. I had just ratified a felony. I was now an accessory after the fact, and I had no idea how to fix it. The first thing I did was pour a glass of water. My hands were steady. A lifetime in courtrooms does that. The panic was there, a cold ball in my stomach, but it was locked away. I had work to do. I had to understand exactly what my son had signed, and more importantly, what I had just confirmed. I went to my study. I pulled the copy of the UCC filing from my briefcase. I ignored the lien details for a moment and looked at the lender, Meridian Capital Partners. I'd never heard of them. A quick search that night told me everything I needed to know. They weren't a bank. They were a private hard money lender, the kind that charges interest rates of 15, sometimes 20%, the kind that operates in the gray areas of the law where due diligence is fast and loose because the profits are so high. Their entire business model was based on collateral, not creditworthiness. They wanted assets they could seize quickly. My house was a perfect target. Paid off. High value. I called an old friend from the district attorney's office, Ben Carter. He'd worked financial crimes for 20 years. I didn't mention Michael. I said a client had come to me with a strange situation involving Meridian. Ben laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He said, "Let me guess. Forged deed, inflated appraisal." My blood went cold. He said Meridian had a reputation. They worked with a network of brokers who found desperate business owners. The brokers would help structure the loan, which often meant fabricating collateral documents. The lenders would look the other way, claiming they relied on the broker's verification. If the loan went bad, they'd foreclose on the asset. If the forgery was discovered, they'd blame the broker, who was usually a shell company that would vanish. It was a system designed to launder fraud. Ben said in the past 3 years, he'd seen a dozen cases with the same pattern. Most victims were elderly or families where one member had secretly pledged a shared asset. He said the FBI was looking at it, but it was slow. "These guys are careful," he said. "They stay just on the right side of plausible deniability." I thanked him and hung up. My son hadn't just made a mistake. He walked into a machine, and he'd fed my home into it. The next morning, I drove to Michael's apartment. He looked like he hadn't slept. I didn't ask to come in. I handed him a notepad and a pen. I said, "You're going to write down everything. The broker's name, every phone number, every email, every document you signed, every conversation you had. You're going to write it in chronological order and you're not leaving anything out." He started to protest. I cut him off. I said, "Michael, you committed at least 3 felonies, forgery in the first degree, theft by deception, filing a false instrument. Do you know what the sentencing guidelines are for that?" Went pale again. He shook his head. I told him, "Up to 15 years, you will go to prison. The only question is whether I can find a way to keep you out. Now write." He wrote for 2 hours. I sat in his living room silent. The story that emerged was one of escalating desperation. The broker's name was David Ross. He'd approached Michael at a business networking event. He was charismatic, well-dressed. He asked about the Oak Room, listened sympathetically to Michael's struggles. He said traditional banks didn't understand visionaries. He said his firm, Ascend Financial, specialized in bridge loans for growing businesses. All they needed was solid collateral. Michael said he had none. David Ross had leaned forward. He said, "What about family assets? Do your parents own their home?" Michael had told him, "Yes, I did." David Ross had smiled. He said, "If you have a vested interest in that property, we can use it. It's a common structure. He asked if I would sign. Michael said I wouldn't. David Ross had paused, then said, well, there are other ways to establish interest. A quitclaim deed is a simple document. If you were added to the title even recently, we could work with that. He'd made it sound like a technicality, a formality. He'd introduced Michael to a notary public who asked no questions. Michael signed my name. The notary stamped it. David Ross handled the rest. He filed the forged deed with the county. He got a rushed appraisal that valued my house at $950,000, far above market value. He presented the package to Meridian Capital. The loan was approved in 72 hours, $740,000. David Ross took a $40,000 broker fee right off the top. The money hit Michael's account. He thought he was saved. He paid off his most urgent debts. He made payroll for 2 months. But the interest payments to Meridian were $11,000 a month. He couldn't make them. He'd missed the first payment, then the second. That's when Meridian sent the man to my door, not to collect from Michael, to verify the collateral, because if they were going to foreclose, they needed to prove the asset was real and that their lien was valid. My confirmation was the last piece of their puzzle. I took the notepad from Michael. I said, you don't speak to David Ross again. You don't answer calls from numbers you don't know. If Meridian calls, you tell them you are seeking legal counsel and all communication must go through your attorney, me. He asked, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to talk to a forger. I needed to understand the deed. I needed to see it up close. The copy from the county records was a scan. I needed the original document Michael had signed. I called David Ross. I used a blocked number. I didn't identify myself as Michael's father. I said I was Michael's new business advisor. I said we were considering a second loan from Meridian and needed copies of all the original collateral documents for our records. He was wary at first. I kept my tone bored, bureaucratic. I said, look, if it's too much trouble, we can just request them directly from Meridian and mention the delay was on your end. He became accommodating quickly. Agreed to meet at a coffee shop the next day. He was exactly as Michael described, smooth, a salesman's smile that didn't reach his eyes. He handed me a manila envelope. I opened it. There it was, the quitclaim deed, granting from me to me and Michael joint tenants. My signature was a clumsy scrawl. It didn't look anything like mine, but the notary seal was real. The notary's commission number was there. I looked at David Ross. I said, the signature seems off. He didn't blink. He said, elderly signature. Sometimes they get shaky. The notary verified the signer's identity. I asked, and who was the notary? He gave me a name, Janet Weller. I nodded as if satisfied. I took the envelope. I said I'd be in touch. I went straight to the law library. I looked up Janet Weller's notary commission. It was active. Her address was a P.O. box in a nearby town. I used a private investigator I'd worked with on divorce cases, a discreet woman named Mara. I asked her to find Janet Weller. It took her 3 days. Janet Weller was a 78-year-old retired bookkeeper. She lived in a small assisted living facility. She had early-stage dementia. Mara talked to the facility director. Janet Weller had notarized documents for a nice young man who visited residents as a volunteer. He asked her to notarize a deed for his grandfather. She'd been happy to help. She didn't remember a name, but Mara showed her a photo of David Ross. Janet Weller smiled. That's the volunteer, she said. David Ross hadn't just used a notary. He preyed on a vulnerable elderly woman to certify a felony. This changed everything. This wasn't just Michael's forgery. This was conspiracy. This was a pattern of predatory behavior that could be proven. I had a lever, but I had to be careful. If I went to the police with this, Michael would be arrested. He was part of the conspiracy, even if he was a dupe. I needed Meridian to break the law first. I needed them to make a move so clearly illegal that it would unravel their entire claim and give me leverage to protect my son. So I waited. I instructed Michael to stop all communication, to not make any more payments, to let the loan go into default. It was the hardest directive I've ever given, letting the clock run out on a ticking bomb. 3 weeks later, the first legal notice arrived. It wasn't a foreclosure notice. It was a notice of default and election to sell. It was addressed to Michael as the borrower and to me as a co-owner of the collateral. It stated that due to non-payment, Meridian Capital would exercise its power of sale under the deed of trust. They scheduled a trustee's sale of my home in 90 days. The notice was formal, cold, and perfectly legal on its face. But it was based on a lie. It listed me as a co-owner. I was not. This was their fatal mistake. They had sent a legal notice affirming the validity of the forged deed. They had put in writing that they believed I was a co-owner. By doing so, they were now actively perpetuating the fraud. I had my evidence. I made 3 copies, one for me, one for my files, and one I put in an envelope addressed to the State Attorney General's Office, Financial Fraud Division. I didn't mail it, not yet. It was my insurance. The next day, I put on my best suit. I hadn't worn it since my retirement dinner. I drove to the offices of Meridian Capital Partners. I didn't have an appointment. I walked into the sleek, glass-walled lobby and told the receptionist my name. I said I was there regarding the loan for the Oak Room and the impending sale of my property. I said I needed to speak to the head of the lending department immediately. They kept me waiting for 20 minutes. A power play. I didn't sit. I stood in the middle of the lobby holding my briefcase, looking at the abstract art on the walls. I was calculating. A man in his late 40s finally came out. He introduced himself as Robert Vance, head of asset management. He didn't offer to shake my hand. He led me to a small, windowless conference room. He sat. I remained standing. I placed the notice of default on the table between us. I pointed to my name, listed as a co-owner. I said, "This is incorrect." He glanced at it unimpressed. He said, "Our documents show you as a grantor on the quitclaim deed and a co-owner on title. The notice is accurate." I said, "The deed is a forgery. The signature is not mine. The notary was fraudulently obtained from an elderly woman with dementia. You have no valid collateral." Robert Vance leaned back. He had the calm of a man who'd had this conversation before. He said, "That's a serious allegation. Our underwriting relied on the documentation provided by the broker and certified by a commissioned notary. If there's fraud, that's a matter between you, your son, and the broker. Our lien is valid. We will proceed with the sale." I opened my briefcase. I took out the original quitclaim deed David Ross had given me. I placed it next to the notice. Then I took out a photocopy of my actual signature from my will, which I'd brought from my files. I laid them side by side. "A blind man could see the difference," I said. "Your due diligence is a joke. You knew or you deliberately avoided knowing." For the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed his face. He said, "Mr. Corrigan, is that your name? You confirmed the details of this loan to our representative at your home. You verified the collateral. That's on the record." I smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. I said, "I confirmed the address of my house." I pointed to a signature and said it looked like mine. "That's not a ratification of a forged document. That's a man being polite to an unexpected guest. If you try to use that in court, I will eat you alive, and I will bring a malicious prosecution counterclaim that will shut down this entire office." The room went very quiet. He was reevaluating me. The retired old man was gone. He was looking at the lawyer. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "3 things. 1, you immediately rescind the notice of default and cancel the trustee's sale. 2, you voluntarily release the lien on my property. 3, you provide me with a full copy of your loan file, including all communications with David Ross and Ascend Financial." He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Impossible," he said. "The loan is in default. We have a right to recover our capital." I said, "You have a right to recover from the borrower and any valid collateral. This collateral is invalid. Pursue my son. He has no assets. You'll get a judgment against a shell, or you can pursue the broker who committed the fraud. But if you touch my house, I will file a complaint with the Attorney General tomorrow morning. I have already documented the exploitation of Janet Weller, the notary. I have evidence of the inflated appraisal. I will not be arguing that you were negligent. I will be arguing that you were complicit." I took the envelope addressed to the Attorney General from my briefcase and placed it on top of the deed. I hadn't mailed it, but he didn't know that. He looked at the envelope. His jaw tightened. He said, "You're bluffing." I said, "Try me, but before you do, ask yourself one question. Why would a retired attorney walk in here alone without his son and lay this out for you? It's because I'm not here to beg. I'm here to give you a choice. Take the loss on a fraudulent loan and avoid a state investigation that could unravel your entire lending portfolio. Or fight me, and I will burn your business to the ground to save my home." I let that hang in the air. I could see the calculations running behind his eyes, the risk assessment, the cost of fighting a protracted legal battle versus writing off a bad loan, the exposure. Finally, he stood up. He said, "I need to consult with our general counsel." I said, "You have 24 hours. If I don't receive a signed lien release by 5 p.m. tomorrow, the complaint goes in the mail." I gathered my documents, leaving the notice of default on the table. I walked out. My heart was pounding, but my hands were still steady. It was a gamble, a huge one. If they called my bluff, I'd have to follow through, and that would mean exposing Michael. I drove home, the adrenaline slowly draining, leaving a hollow fatigue. I checked my phone. No calls from Michael. That was good. I walked into my quiet house. The silence felt different now. It felt like the calm before a storm. The phone rang at 4:45 the next afternoon. It was Robert Vance. His voice was flat, stripped of all its polished confidence. He said, "We will rescind the notice and cancel the sale. We will not release the lien." I started to speak, but he cut me off. "We can't, it's not just us," he explained. Meridian Capital hadn't kept the loan, they sold it. Almost immediately after funding, they packaged it with a dozen other high-interest loans into a financial product called a collateralized loan obligation. They sold slices of that CLO to institutional investors. My house, as collateral, was now part of that investment pool. Releasing the lien would require the consent of the trustee managing the CLO, a major investment bank. It would trigger disclosures. It would force Meridian to buy back the loan at a loss and potentially expose the fraud to the investors. They would never agree. My gamble had just hit a wall of Wall Street complexity. The lien wasn't theirs to release. It was owned by a faceless trust, managed by a bank in another state, answerable to pension funds and insurance companies. Vance wasn't lying. I could hear it in his voice. He was giving me the truth because the truth was now a better weapon for him than a lie. He said, "The sale is off. That's the best I can do. The lien stays. If your son defaults, the trustee will eventually initiate foreclosure. It might take a year, but it will happen." He paused. "I'm sorry." He hung up. I sat at my kitchen table, the phone in my hand. I had outmaneuvered the local predator, only to find it was connected to a vast, impersonal system. A system designed to be immune to individual pleas. A system that would, with perfect legal efficiency, take my home because of a forgery it had profitably packaged and sold. The law I knew was about people, arguments, evidence. This was about algorithms and spreadsheets. I felt a despair I hadn't felt since Elena's diagnosis. Then a colder, sharper feeling cut through the despair. Anger, directed focus. If the system was the problem, then I had to use the system against itself. I couldn't attack the CLO, but I could attack the fraud at its source with such force and publicity that the system would have to spit my house out to avoid contamination. I needed a bigger lever. I needed David Ross, not to threaten him, to flip him, to get him to testify against Meridian. He was the vulnerable link, the broker, the one who directly committed the crimes. If I could offer him a path out that was worse for Meridian than it was for him, he might talk. But I needed something on him, something undeniable. I called Mara the investigator. I asked her to find everything she could on David Ross and Ascend Financial, not just his address, his debts, his car loan, his ex-wife, his habits, where he drank, who he was afraid of. She called back 2 days later. David Ross had a gambling problem. He owed $60,000 to a casino in Reno. He'd been sued twice by other clients for misrepresentation, but the cases were settled quietly. He lived in a rented apartment. Ascend Financial was a registered LLC, but it had no office, no employees. It was a shell. And Mara found one more thing. David Ross had a younger brother serving time in a federal prison for wire fraud. Ross visited him every month. I had my angle. The next evening, I parked outside the sports bar Mara said Ross frequented. I saw him through the window, sitting alone at the bar, watching a game. I waited an hour. He paid his tab and walked out. I got out of my car and fell into step beside him on the sidewalk. He jumped when he saw me. "We need to talk, David," I said. "Not here." He tried to brush past me. I said, "We can talk here, or we can talk in front of the state attorney general's investigator tomorrow. Your choice. But if you think Meridian is going to protect you, you're wrong. They just sold your fraud to a pension fund in Ohio." He stopped walking. He looked at me, his face pale under the streetlight. I said, "There's a diner around the corner, 5 minutes." We sat in a sticky vinyl booth. I didn't mince words, I laid it out. I knew about Janet Weller. I knew about the forged deed. I knew Meridian had sold the loan. I said, "You're the fall guy, David. When this unravels, Meridian will say you defrauded them too. They'll throw you to the wolves. You'll join your brother." He was sweating. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want you to wear a wire." He stared at me like I'd suggested he set himself on fire. "No way," he whispered, his eyes darting around the diner. "They'll know. Vance will know." I leaned forward. "They already know you're the weak link. Your only chance is to give me something I can use to force their hand. You get me a recording of Vance acknowledging the forged deed or discussing the pattern, and I give that to the authorities. You become a cooperating witness, not the mastermind." He shook his head, panicked. Played my final card. "David, you visit your brother in Lewisburg every third Sunday. You think he wants you joining him? You think your mother can handle 2 sons in prison? Get me the recording, or I walk out of here and file the complaint with everything I have on you, and you will never see the outside of a cell again." The fight drained out of him. He was a cornered animal and he knew it. He asked, "What do I say?" I told him. "You call Vance. You tell him you're nervous. You tell him the borrower's father is a lawyer making noise about the deed. You ask for reassurance. You ask what the plan is if the deed is challenged. You get him talking." It took 3 days for David Ross to work up the nerve. He called me from a payphone. He said he had a meeting with Vance in an hour at Meridian's offices. He was wearing a wire provided by a contact of mine from the old days, a retired police detective who owed me a favor. I sat in my car 2 blocks from Meridian's building, listening to the feed through an earpiece. My hands were not steady this time. I heard the door open, the muffled greetings, David's voice strained. "Robert, I need to know we're covered on this Oak Room thing. The old man is sharp." Vance's voice dismissive. "We've been over this. The deed is filed. The notary is valid. It's done." David pressed, his fear making him sound convincingly desperate. "But if he proves it's fake?" "I mean, the signature's bad, Robert. You saw it." There was a long pause. I held my breath. Then Vance spoke, his voice lower, conspiratorial. "Look, the deed is a formality. The collateral is the house. The house is real. Our job is to secure the asset. The paperwork, that's your department. If there's a problem with the paperwork, that's on you and your notary. We relied on your verification. That's what we'll say in court. Now stop worrying. The loan is packaged. It's someone else's problem now." That was it. That was the admission. The paperwork is your department. We relied on your verification. He just confirmed they knew the documentation was David's responsibility and they had deliberately avoided looking too closely. It was evidence of willful blindness, enough for a prosecutor. I said into my microphone, "Get out of there, David, now." I heard chairs scrape, mumbled goodbyes. 20 minutes later, David Ross met me in the same parking lot, his hands shaking as he handed over the recording device. He looked sick. I told him to leave town for a week, to visit his brother, to stay quiet. I drove home. I made a digital copy of the recording. I transcribed the key exchange. And then I drafted a new letter. This one wasn't to the Attorney General. It was to the trustee of the collateralized loan obligation, the investment bank that now technically owned the lien on my house. I enclosed the transcript. I enclosed a copy of the quitclaim deed and my real signature. I enclosed a summary of the fraud, including the exploitation of Janet Weller. And I wrote a cover letter that was a masterpiece of cold, legal threat. I explained that their security interest was based on a fraudulent instrument. That I had audio evidence implicating the originator in knowingly accepting faulty documentation. That if they attempted to enforce the lien, I would sue them for participating in a fraudulent scheme. I would name them in the complaint to the Attorney General. I would contact the financial press. The resulting scandal and regulatory scrutiny would cost them far more than the $740,000 of this one toxic loan. I sent it by certified mail with a copy to Robert Vance at Meridian Capital. I included a note for Vance. "Your conversation with Mr. Ross was informative. The trustee has been notified. The choice is now yours. Clean this up quietly or watch it explode." I waited. The silence was the deepest yet. Michael called every day, a nervous wreck. I told him to hold on, to trust the process. He asked if he was going to jail. I told him I was doing everything I could to prevent that. But I couldn't promise. 7 days later my phone rang, a blocked number. It was Robert Vance. He didn't say hello. He said, "The trustee has instructed us to remediate the situation." His voice was hollow. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means we are buying the loan back from the CLO at par. We will then nullify it. We will issue a full lien release. Your property will be cleared." "And the forged deed?" I asked. "We will file a corrective affidavit with the county recorder, stating the quitclaim deed was filed in error and is void." "And my son?" There was a longer pause. "We will not pursue criminal action against the borrower for default. We consider the matter settled upon the return of our capital." "Which you're not getting," I stated. "No," he said, the word tight with bitterness. "We are not." He was agreeing to eat the entire loss, to pay back the investors with their own money and wipe the slate clean. The fraud was so toxic, the exposure so great, that it was cheaper for them to lose $750,000 than to fight. I had won. "Send the documents to my attorney," I said, and gave him Howard's information. I hung up. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, and then a surge of grief for my son, for the trust that was broken, for the sheer stupidity of it all. The documents arrived 2 days later. Howard reviewed them. The lien release was in perfect order. The corrective affidavit was filed. The county records were updated. My title was clear. The financial threat was gone. Now came the human cost. I sat Michael down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd confronted him months before. I told him the lien was released. He wouldn't lose the house. He started to cry, tears of relief. Then I told him the rest, that he had committed felonies. That the only reason he wasn't being charged was because the victimized lender, for their own reasons, had chosen not to pursue it. But that didn't erase the crime. There have to be consequences, Michael, I said. Real ones, or you'll never learn. I had already spoken with Ben Carter, my friend at the DA's office. I'd given him the recording, the files on David Ross and Janet Weller. I'd told him everything. Ben said if Michael cooperated fully, testified if needed against the broker network, and made restitution, he could likely arrange for pretrial diversion. No prison, a felony on his record that could be expunged after years of good behavior, but he would have to plead guilty, he would have to do community service, and he would have to pay back the money, not to Meridian, they'd forfeited that right, but to a victim's compensation fund for financial fraud. I told Michael this was the deal. The only one, he had to close the restaurant, sell the equipment, liquidate everything. The dream was over. He would have to get a job, live modestly, and pay back every cent with interest over the next 10 years. He listened, his face ashen. He nodded. He said, "Okay, Dad." There was no fight left in him, just shame and a dawning understanding of the magnitude of what he'd done. The Oak Room closed its doors for good a month later. Michael sold what he could. He moved into a small apartment. He got a job as a manager for a reputable restaurant group. He started making payments. The criminal case proceeded quietly. David Ross, in exchange for his cooperation and the recording, received a similar deal. Meridian Capital was investigated by the state. They settled for a large fine and agreed to overhaul their practices. Robert Vance left the company. I never heard from him again. The surprising detail, the one I didn't expect, came from Janet Weller, the notary. After the case was settled, I went to visit her at the assisted living facility. I brought flowers. I told her what had happened, that the man who tricked her had been stopped. She held my hand. Her memory was foggy, but she understood she'd been used. She said, "I just wanted to help. I always tried to help." I told her she had by being part of stopping them. It wasn't entirely true, but it felt necessary to say. As I was leaving, the activities director stopped me. She said, "You know, after that man visited her, Janet became withdrawn. She stopped wanting to notarize documents for the other residents, something she loved doing. She felt her trust was broken." That hit me harder than any legal threat. The collateral damage wasn't just financial. It was in the quiet erosion of an old woman's faith in her own usefulness. Michael and I are rebuilding. It's slow. We have dinner every Sunday. The conversations are careful, but they're real. He's working hard. The arrogance is gone, replaced by a grim determination. He's my son. I love him, but I see him differently now. And he sees me differently, not just as his father, but as the man who stood between him and ruin, who used every tool he had to pull him back from the edge. The house is quiet. It's just me here, but it's still mine. Every paid-off inch of it. I walk through the room sometimes and think of Alina. She would have been furious at Michael, and then she would have insisted we help him. She was better at holding those two things at once than I am. I had the lower branches of the oak tree trimmed last week. The guy who did it asked if I wanted to take the whole limb off. I said no, just trim it back, let the light in. That's all you can ever do, really. Trim back the damage, let the light in. And wait for the new growth. So the house is still mine, the legal threat is gone, but the story doesn't end with a cleared title. It ends with a question that sits in my quiet living room every evening. How many other fathers are out there, right now, unaware that their life's work has been silently pledged against a desperate gamble? The statistics say it's more than you think. Over 58,000 reported victims in just 5 years. Over $1.3 billion lost. And those are just the ones who found out. The machines of Meridian Capital and brokers like David Ross are still running. They target equity, they target silence, they target the space between what we know about our families and what we're afraid to ask. My advantage was that I knew the law, I could speak their language, I could fight in their arena, but what about the people who can't? What about the retired teacher, the widowed nurse, the couple who saved for 40 years? They are the real targets. This isn't a story about outsmarting a system. It's a story about a system that is designed to prey on the ordinary. My son was the conduit, but he was also a victim of a different kind, a victim of his own ambition and of predators who sell hope wrapped in fraud. The lingering damage isn't the money, it's the trust. The trust between parent and child. The trust that the documents in the county recorder's office are real. The trust that a notary's stamp means something. That's what was truly stolen, and that's much harder to get back. I look at Michael now, working his long hours to pay a debt to fund he can't see, and I see a man trying to rebuild his integrity from the ground up. That is his consequence. And my consequence is knowledge. I know now that the greatest threat to your legacy may not be a stranger in a mask. It may be a well-dressed man with a folder at your door, or it may be the silence you keep from the people you love most. Protect your title, check your records, talk to your family, have the difficult conversations before the crisis arrives. Because once the paperwork is filed and the money changes hands, you're not just fighting a lender, you're fighting a machine, and all machines care about is the collateral. Thanks for listening. If this story resonated with you or made you think twice about your own protections, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told.